Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archeo Viking. Today we have yet another special guest, Laura Martinez. Uh, she's an indigenous historian, and I brought her on here to talk about her master's research. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Laura?
To Anja, hello, my name's Laura. I'm Diamond Dog 74 on TikTok, and I have a master's in US history with a focus on Indigenous North American history. And I've done a lot, specifically research on Spanish contact in northern Mexico in the US Mexico borderlands.
Ah, well, cool. And first off, how did you get interested in the field of history overall?
So I have always loved history since I was a little kid,
Mm.
and I was always reading. Um, when I was little, my mom taught me how to read at a really young age. And when I ran out of books that I hadn't read, I read the encyclopedia.
Mm.
So I was probably 4 or 5. And I, in particular, was really interested in like ancient Egypt and the Soviet Union and any parts of it where it talked about like history or archaeology.
Mm.
And then when I was 10, my parents took me to Mexico and we visited the ancient Mayan city Tulum.
Oh.
And I was just absolutely fascinated by everything that was around me. And when I initially went to college, I wanted to be an archaeologist. And I started as an anthropology major. And after 2 years of anthropology major, I switched to history because I realized I was more interested in the actual history of things rather than the archaeological aspect to it. And then I became an ethnohistorian, which is kind of the baby of history and archaeology. So,
Well, personally, I think you should have gone with the archaeology, but then again, I'm biased. I'm an archaeologist, so
right.
you know. All right. Well, why don't you tell us about your research?
Okay.
Yes.
So when I first went to graduate school, I when I like wrote my letter and everything, I wanted
Mhm.
initially to study 20th century warrior societies.
Yeah.
And that was my initial plan. I was gonna like look at AIM and stuff like that. And then one of the first classes I had in graduate school, we read the book Peace Came in the Form of a Woman by Juliana Barr. Fantastic book. And she kind of starts to talk about what I ended up researching, but then she kind of goes in another direction.
Mm.
And I was like, okay, but I want to learn more about this. And so that's what I ended up focusing a lot of my research on. And so I mostly do research about like Spanish contact in like parts of Mexico and what's now the American Southwest and part up into California, like the parts of the United States that were at one point in time Mexico. And I primarily study sexual assault and sexual assault as a tool of colonization, but also how people upon like first encounters, they didn't have a language in common and people were using their own interpretations of what they were encountering
Mm.
based on their own culture, both the native people and the Spanish people. But the native people were not assaulting the Spanish in mass. It was the other way around.
Yeah.
And so I look at that and just how that started and then led into the modern day crisis that we face of missing and murdered Indigenous women, as well as the fact that, today Native people are 2.5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than our non-Native peers. And so I look at the like origins of that and how that contributed to the current day situation that we're dealing with.
Okay. And so, well, then let's just go back to the beginning. So, when it all began in this, I don't want to say narrative because that I feel like the term narrative it assumes that it's fictional, but is the best way I can describe it. In this narrative that you have created via your research, uh, how did it sort of begin?
So, the Spanish are coming into, when they got into Tenochtitlan in 1521, by the 1540s, they were in what is now the American Southwest.
Mm.
And so they're making their own interpretations on the women that they're encountering and the cultures that they're encountering based off of Spanish culture, because that, we all view the world through our own cultural lenses and biases, right?
Yeah.
So they're doing the same, and so then they're making interpretations, and they're encountering matrilineal societies, whereas they come from a patrilineal society, and they're encountering cultures where women are treated with a lot more respect than Spanish women were treated. And they're also coming from a time period where women in Spain often still practiced veiling, which was left over from the Moors and the Islamic Empire.
And what is veiling exactly?
So where women would, literally like cover their entire face and their head.
Oh, veiling. Okay,
Yeah.
I thought you said bail with a B. I
Oh,
apologize.
no, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
So women in Spain in this time period, many women still practiced veiling, and then they're encountering, people in the Caribbean, people in Mexico and the Southwest, which are all hot environments. And they also did not, the native culture that they're encountering did not have the same like sexual mores and taboos that Europe did when it came to women and their clothing. So, oftentimes, depending on the tribe, men and women kind of pretty much dress the same, like a skirt or a loincloth, and nothing on the top half unless it was cold. And then they would, put on a poncho or something like that. And so they immediately interpreted this to mean that Native women were somehow more sexually available than Spanish women.
Yeah.
And they also made their own interpretations based off of some really interesting things. Like when they entered Tenochtitlan, they decided to, they used women's makeup to determine which women they thought were sex workers, and therefore, even more available. And there was a group of women who were like, they worked in the temple and stuff, and they wore a lot of red makeup. And in Spanish culture, red, symbolized sex workers. So they made their own interpretations of that. Okay, these, women who work in the temple as like spiritual workers and that kind of thing are the sex workers here. And so they just started assaulting these women. And, as they continued going north, a lot of times when, and the Spanish, they wrote everything down. Like they literally would write down how far they walked. They would write down how many cows they butchered in a day. And then they would write down descriptions of the people that they're encountering and their interpretations based off of, initial encounters. And so I, read a lot of Spanish archives, as well as, works from other historians as well, that there's like a lot of people who kind of, like I said, they kind of touch on the subject, but then they don't really go into depth. So I wanted to take this subject and I wanted to go into depth on it.
Yeah.
And so, there's a lot of times where when first greeting, this is something Juliana Barr writes about. So when the Spanish were coming up into the Southwest, they found that they had a lot more success in first encounters with Native people when they carried a banner of the Virgin Mary in front of them. And they thought it was somehow some sort of divine situation, where what it really was in a lot of North American Native cultures, a group of all men traveling together is typically going to be a war party.
Yeah.
And if you want to symbolize that you have peaceful intentions, you put the women in the front. Be like, hey guys, we're not here to fight, that kind of thing. So the Spanish, who had very few women traveling with them, carrying that banner in front of them, was indicating to the native people, we're here for peaceful intentions. And so the native people, based on their own cultures as well, would be putting the women in the front. Women were involved in, greetings and ceremonies to welcome people and that kind of thing. And the Spanish interpreted these women being in the front and these women being a part of these greetings and ceremonies as they're giving us these women. And that was very far from the truth. And you hear that a lot in Spanish accounts, that they gave us these women. Like, we're just be a part of the ceremony, or they were in the front of this greeting party that's encountering this large army.
Yeah.
That were, so it's, a lot of these initial contact areas, there's a lot of misinterpretation involved. But they also, as they continued colonizing, and they continued assaulting women, they found that it was a good means of controlling a population.
Of course.
And and so they continued doing it. And, even up when they started building missions, they started in like Texas and New Mexico, Arizona, and then up into California. And they kind of got progressively worse as they went west. And they would imprison Native people and enslave them in these missions. And the women were repeated victims of sexual assault in the missions. And, when women are repeatedly victims of assault, it affects their mental health. It affects their physical health, and it affects their immune systems. And so these women who were imprisoned in the missions were experiencing this, and then they are experiencing mental health difficulties, and they're experiencing physical symptoms related to repeated assaults, as well as the fact that they're being locked in these rooms at night. And these diseases are sweeping through there very quickly as well. And, repeated assaults going to lower your immune system, so you're more likely to catch diseases. And so it was incredibly devastating for the people who were imprisoned and enslaved in the missions. But then, like I said, the Spanish see this effect on the people that they're enslaving and imprisoning, and they see this as a good form of control.
Yeah.
And then as, time progressed and you get the, English coming in and the Spanish and the Portuguese, the Spanish were the first ones here. So they kind of set the stage for how indigenous North American and South American people were to be treated. And so the other colonizing powers followed suit and treated these people in similar manners. And, once you get up into like where the English and the French colonies were in the northern parts, women are going to be less covered. It's colder, but they're still seeing Native women as more sexual and just inherently by nature as sexual objects, because they were less than European women. So while it wouldn't have been acceptable to assault a European woman, they viewed Native women as fair game. And that continued, and it just became a part of the culture of North and South America, that Native women are somehow inherently more sexual and inherently more available to white men than non-Native women. And you see this when Europeans are also colonizing other parts of the world as well, including Africa and Asia. They encounter, women all over the world, and they view the women as less than and as more sexual and more available.
Yeah, and that's an unfortunate thing that happens all the time. The one thing I will tell you that I think will probably make you a little happy, when Spain came across China, they didn't have a great time. I have a video about that. So it was in fact essentially a Chinese warlord by the name of Kozinga, who is sort of rebelling against the Imperial Chinese uh, at the time. He decided, hey, I'm going to invade the Spanish Philippines, and apparently the Spanish withdrew all their forces from all their campaigns back to Manila,
Oh
and
wow.
most people at the time and most historians think that Kozinga probably would have won. He had a large enough and advanced enough army that he could have won. There's a little silver lining. They did not have a fun time other place. So,
That's good.
yeah. So of course, all of that is very horrible to hear. Did How to phrase this? I'm sure some of that, a lot of that had to do some with, say, the reason things like the Pueblo Revolt began in 1680. Uh, would I be correct in that assumption?
Absolutely. That definitely was a contributing factor to the Pueblo Revolt, as well as um, other events that occurred in the Southwest and in Mexico where Native people were rebelling against the Spanish.
Mm.
Um, that was, absolutely contributing factors. Other contributing factors
Yeah, of
included,
course.
enslavement of people in missions and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Apache in Texas in particular were targeted for enslavement in New Orleans, and they would kidnap children in particular to enslave them. So there are, a large
Of
number
course.
of factors that included into that, but that's definitely a factor.
Yeah, and of course, yeah, and there's always a large number of factors because no war was ever started for one single reason. There's always a whole slew of reasons.
Right.
Sometimes some are more shaky than the rest. Sometimes the reasons are just excuses for somebody to go to war because they want more land. But then there are other reasons that might have been, like what we're talking about now, more important
Yeah.
to go to
Yeah,
war. Yeah.
absolutely.
So, um, let's see here. So you mentioned that the Spanish wrote everything down. Where do we generally find these sources? I'm assuming, like, say, in Coronado's journals, perhaps.
Yeah, a lot of, not only like Coronado, but a lot of like all of the conquistadors kept
Yeah,
journal of
yeah,
their day-to-day activities, as well as a lot of the men that were with them. In particular, like the priests that they brought along with them, they would chronicle their day-to-day activities. Some of them are only accessible by physically going to an archive, but with
of course,
the modern digital age that we have, a lot of these archives are available digitized.
yeah.
Um, Oftentimes they do require, when I was a university student, thankfully I had things like JSTOR and stuff like that
Yeah,
that were paid for by the university, and I definitely miss that.
yeah, I missed that
Um,
a lot too. Yeah,
yeah, and so thankfully, as a university student, at least, I had access to a lot of these archives that are digitized. And unfortunately for me, I studied French. So I can speak Spanish, but I don't read it very well. And with these archives being digitized, especially because at this time period that they are writing down these journals and chronicles, the spelling was not standardized yet.
yeah,
So that makes my reading comprehension even lower. And so also thankfully I'm able to translate them when they're digitized and read them in English, which makes it a lot easier for me. I studied French in college because I took both French and Spanish in high school, and I liked both languages, but then I was like, I'm really good at French, I'm going to keep taking it. So I ended up minoring in French as an undergraduate and then
oh,
studying Spanish contact. So
oh,
that was,
that's interesting. And and you mentioned, while we're on the Spanish contact, you mentioned that it continued, of course, past Spanish contact. Um, Now, of course, I'm going sort of towards the once Mexico became independent from Spain. Um, and I sort of want to ask you and sort of have you touch upon, like, the uh, sort of role that white people who weren't, say, the part of the Spanish Empire, like, say, the Comancheros and such. The white people who would, capture people illegally and sell them to various tribes, like the Comanches, hence their name, but not just the Comanches, and also to Mexico. So, sort of, what role did they play, and what role did Mexico, like the Republic of Mexico, play? If you did look into
So, I mean, Mexico, as well as the United States, and
that.
even during the time period where Texas was the Republic of Texas for
Yeah.
11 years, it basically, the precedent had already been set by that point in time that this was how Native people and Native women were to be treated. And it had been by that time pretty well established that, white folks treated Native people in this way. Mexico had a whole caste system where, indigenous people and then later enslaved African people were on the bottom. And then you've got their varying categories of mixed race, where the mother or the father was white, made a difference on where somebody would fall in the hierarchy as well. And so by that point in time, this is just well established part of the culture. And you see it, coming all the way into our modern day, North American culture. You see the sexy Indian princess costumes, or, that kind of thing. It's just ingrained into the culture of the Americas that Native women are in some way more sexually available to white folk. And that is part of what contributes to this high rate of sexual assault among Native women. And nearly 90% of the assaulters who are committing these crimes are non-Native. And that is also, I think, a really important factor in that, and I had, when I was defending my thesis, I was so frustrated because I'm, sitting in this room full of white people defending my thesis. And the first paragraph says 86% of the assaulters, according to Amnesty International, are not Native. First paragraph, right? And one of the people on the defense committee was like, well, couldn't this just be a cultural thing? And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, in Native culture, couldn't this just be a cultural thing that Native men? And I'm like, did you even read this 30-page paper I gave you?
Yeah.
Like, it says in the first paragraph. And he's like, is that number really accurate? And it literally took my advisor, who was also white, like backing me up, like, no, Laura's correct.
Yeah.
For this guy to believe what I was saying.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate.
And so, it's just, I mean, this also being the same guy who tried to say that when I said that, Spanish started it and it led into the modern day, he also was like, well, that'd be like saying that the reason was why Americans are so prudish today is because of the Puritans. And I'm like, but that is the reason.
Yeah, that's exactly the reason.
Like,
yeah, that's exactly. Well, I mean, especially the Europeans from like the New England area, because the South had the colonists who settled in Virginia in the South had a different culture,
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
For example, my home state Georgia was a penal colony where mostly Scottish, Irish, and German debtors came. So there's that. Very different culture there. But yeah, exactly. But that is exactly what it is. That's why a lot of not even just the Puritans, but also, I mean, the Spanish were in the American Southwest for up until the 1840s, and then really you could say that they were still there, even though Mexico declared independence. It's essentially the same thing. And then they didn't lose that until the 1850s. So Catholicism still was and still is a major playing figure there. So yes, that's exactly why Americans are the way they are.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, I think that it's really strange to have like this guy who's a historian sitting there saying that the past is in no way contributing to the present day situation, because literally, like everything, every aspect of the history of a place is going to contribute to the modern situation that people are dealing with. Like, that's just unavoidable. That's how history works,
Exactly. Well, and it's and people like that are also the same people who say that, oh, we can't call something bad in the past because we have to base it on the standards then. And I always like to point out, well, people back then also thought it was wrong too. I mean, there are multiple people in U.S. history alone who participated in horrible massacres against Native Americans who regretted it later on. One of my favorite ones to point out is Davy Crockett, who was a senator, but when he was, he, during the War of 1812, he was a scout in Andrew Jackson's army, and Andrew Jackson and his soldiers forced the troops to shove a whole bunch of Muskogee Creek Indians into a barn and set it, not a barn, into a hut and set it on fire. And actually, I don't know if you remember the Alamo movie with Billy Bob Thornton playing Davy Crockett from like 2006.
I never saw it, but
It's it's a
um,
yeah, but David Crockett tells a story in his autobiography and in the movie where he's like, after that, he's like, we found sweet potatoes that had been cooked in the grease, and everyone in his brigade but him ate the sweet potato.
oh my
And
God.
he's just talking about his horror at this happening, and then you see him as a senator fighting to stop Indian removal and things like that. He was an opponent of Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act and things like that. So it's like, so there were people during those times who were against these things that were happening. And so to
Right.
say, oh, we can't base it up, we can't call it wrong because we have to base it on their standards. Well, by their standards, they thought it was wrong. The Dakota 38 plus 2, there were a whole bunch of people on, including military officers on the East Coast, who were like, hey, this is unconstitutional and wrong. And then it still happened, so
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting, you mentioned Davy Crockett is, he was one of the people at the Alamo,
yeah.
right? And it's interesting because my tribe remembers the Alamo a lot
Oh,
differently.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And because not only was the Alamo initially built to imprison us,
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure.
um,
Yeah.
but the actual famous Battle of the Alamo, we have stories that are passed down about
Oh, really?
being up on the hillside and watching what was going on and being like, do we help any of these guys or what do we do? And just being like, meh, we're just gonna leave them to it.
Well, and the thing is, the funny thing about that is Sam Houston actually told, because Sam Houston and Davy Crockett were friends, and he was like, "Hey, going there is a terrible idea. You're not going to be able to hold out against them." And they're like, "Oh, we'll be fine." And then the rest is history. So again, even other white people were like, "Hey, this is a terrible place to defend yourself.
Yeah.
Don't do this." So yeah, and that's unfortunate, but of course, a lot of people, as you know, what more than I do, people of color tend to still face a lot of criticism and questioning of whether or not they know as much. I have a coworker who at one of her at her second job, she faces a lot of flack from one of her bosses because we can't really figure out why. We just assume that it's because she's black, because she doesn't do it to any of the white employees. So, but things like that, and so that's unfortunate to hear about. But you know, if
Yeah,
you,
when I started graduate school, my advisor warned me that as a, AFAB individual and as a person
yeah,
of color, that I'm going to have to work harder than my peers. And she was absolutely right.
oh,
I
cool.
had to work 3 times as hard as, any of my classmates just to have people pay attention to me.
Yeah,
And that was really difficult um, because I had to work harder than everybody else just to even be heard in any semblance, and then also still frequently just shut down. And so that was really really difficult in graduate school to deal with.
yeah, and I'm sorry to hear that, and I know that you're looking to at some point go back for your doctorate. I don't know if you've decided what you want to go into yet, but I hope you have a better experience in that than you did. Uh,
Yeah, I don't know, it is something I've been considering. I haven't decided for sure if I'm going to go for the PhD or if I'm just going to keep going with the masters, but
and that's fine
it
too.
is
Yeah.
it is something I'm considering now. So yeah, I'm sure that unfortunately though, it's probably something I'm going to deal with in any academic setting. Academia is tough,
Yeah,
and it's just, how it is. It's very competitive, it's very difficult, and
yeah.
just kind of the way of academia.
Oh yeah, most definitely. Okay, so do you have any books that you would recommend reading on, or that are either on the subject? I know you mentioned there's not much, but on either on the subject or adjacent to the subject, that you would recommend people read to get a better look at the history that isn't just, the typical Western movie where the Apaches and the Comanches are the bad guys.
Right. So definitely the book that I mentioned by Juliana Barr, Peace Came in the Form of a Woman.
Okay.
Uh, I would also add to that list, the author's name is Albert Hurtado, and I cannot remember the title of the book off the top of my head, but it's about missions in California.
Okay.
Um, there's a book by Ramon Gutierrez called When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away, which is really good, but it does use some really, really outdated language.
Okay.
It's an older book, but it does have a lot of really good information about sex and sexuality and women in the Pueblo people, as well as Two-Spirit people, which he does use a really offensive and outdated term to describe Two-Spirit people. But that would be the Birdash term, which basically means like a male sex worker. But
Yeah.
so that was really frequently used in a lot of older texts, and it's not used anymore because it is really offensive.
Yeah.
And then there's a book called Bodies in Contact. That's a collection of articles, and it's about contact and colonization, not just in the Americas, but all over the world, and the body as a zone of contact.
Yeah.
And there are a few really good articles in that book that talk about indigenous people in the Americas and that kind of thing. So those are definitely some books that I would, the entire book of Bodies in Contact is very good. It talks about Asia, Africa, Australia, and the Americas and colonization. And so the entirety of the book is really good, but there are some specific articles. That was one that talks about Nawa people. There's one about Métis people. So there are some really good articles in there also that talk about North and South America.
Good, good. And I have yet to buy the book. I intend to, but I would also suggest you or anyone else watching, there is a book that I intend to buy that's about the archaeology of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. I actually plan to use it as a source for a video on the subject in the next couple of months. So there's that, because I most certainly think archaeology is very important in this, especially considering much of, because despite, as you will have said in many of your TikTok videos, the idea that indigenous people didn't have writing is an outdated idea. But of course, much of that was destroyed by the Spanish and by the British, and not quite as much by the French, because of course the French were a lot more. We're a lot less evil towards the Native Americans than the British. They were by no means necessarily great, but they were, when you're comparing the other two, they were most definitely the lesser of three evils. But so I think looking at the archaeology of these events is very important. Um,
Yeah,
whether it be the Pueblo Revolt or say the Yamasee War in the Carolinas, which is something I've read quite a lot about the archaeology of, and things like that. So I do think that's important to look at as well.
absolutely. And as an ethnohistorian myself, that's part of what we do in ethnohistory. We don't just look at, because traditionally in the field of history, you mostly see people counting as valid sources pen to paper in a European language, which obviously is very skewed and only is giving you a tiny picture. So what ethno-historians do is we not only do we look at the European sources, but we also look at, oral history,
Yeah.
native forms of writing, and the archaeological record to come to the most accurate picture of what was happening at that time period as possible.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we do as ethno-historians. So we're not actually out there doing the archaeological work, but we're listening to what archaeologists are saying about the archaeological work and
Yeah.
incorporating that.
Yeah. Well, like for example, I don't know if you saw the video I did about it on TikTok, but for example, in the past couple of months, I want to say, I don't remember exactly when I did it. Archaeologists discovered that horses broke free from the Spanish about 100 years earlier than previously thought. So that explains why they were already so ingrained in plains and southwestern and plains Native American culture, is because they had that much time to get it. So of course, 100 years is plenty of time to have some sort of origin story, spring up for how they showed up.
And
so
in addition to that, archaeologists have found, because there was an American species of horse that went extinct.
Of course, yes.
And they initially thought that it went extinct like 10,000 years ago, but archaeologists have found that it went extinct more recently than that.
Yeah.
So I think that horses, not only did they arrive by way of the Spanish earlier than people thought, but also they were extinct recently enough to still have been part of the collective consciousness.
Yeah, because I think that was like, instead of like 12,000 years ago, I think it was now like six. That, don't quote me on it. I'm just trying to remember, but I think it was more like around 6,000 or so, or something like that years ago. You feel free to find the article and correct me. I don't remember exactly when, but which is far more recent than 12,000 years ago when they originally thought to have gone extinct. Which also matches up because while overhunting by humans on all continents, not just in the Americas, certainly played a factor in the extinction of megafauna, it was not the only factor. There was also climate, things like that.
Absolutely.
But also to say that overhunting didn't happen is a little naive, because humans are humans, and that's just seems to be what we do. But and that's exactly it. So those oral histories are important. Now I'm also a firm believer that and I hold the same standard to my religion, heathenry, but I'm a firm believer that mythic literalism shouldn't be taken to the extreme, because then you got people like evangelical Christians claiming horrible things. But at the same time, oral history is very important, and I really hate when people pull it's the telephone thing, so oral history is not valid. It's like, that's not the same thing. You have a specific person who knows the stories and then passes those stories down to a specific person. It's not the same thing, and they make sure that those stories are passed down exactly as they know them.
Well, and I remember growing up with stories about why the Apache and the Navajo separated into two different tribes, and the Navajo version is the same. We have the same story that's been passed down, and why our ancestors left the Pacific Northwest and Canada area and came into the Southwest to begin with. That's going to match up with the archaeological record, you know. And so you can't completely discount oral history, especially when the accounts that people are sharing and saying, this is why my ancestors left the Pacific Northwest, matches up with the archaeological record.
Yeah, and that's why I'm a firm believer in oral history. I'm not an ethno historian. I'll leave that to y'all. I'm going into lithics and things like that, stone tools. But I definitely respect and feel that ethnohistory and ethnoarchaeology and things like that are important.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And even like for me, part of why that field was so appealing is that I'm a Native person, and I grew up with our oral history, and there's some really well-known pictographs in Southwest Texas that were made by my tribe, as well as a few others. And so I grew up with that side of things. And I'm able to bring that knowledge into what I'm doing as a historian as well.
Yeah, and that's I'm sure that's a very cool, and that's and I think that's very important. I mean, I remember John Torres Navajo Rocks before he left TikTok actually talking about that, talking about
Yeah.
how an indigenous perspective in these fields is important, which is why I've been bringing indigenous people on. So far you're only the second, but that's the whole point, is to bring these perspectives into our indigenous perspectives of archaeology and history into uh the public view. um
Right.
you know
Yeah.
and of course not, and as you yourself have brought up many times, Native American people are not a monolith. There are some people, just like white people, who have weird views that aren't necessarily correct, uh, which unfortunately is actually a byproduct of white teachings. I'm pretty damn sure, um, but that doesn't mean that your perspectives aren't important. And I would argue,
Right.
but no, I would not argue. I would state for fact that indigenous Native American perspectives on the history of their continent are the most important part of these fields. So yeah, so we're gonna end this in a second, but how would you suggest to women and specifically Native American women, but women overall, to get interested in history and go into the field? Would you suggest it? Would you maybe, because of your experiences, um, discourage from it? What would you say? So
Well, I mean, I definitely encourage anybody who, I have a nephew in the Native way who is, currently an archaeology student.
mm,
And, I definitely encourage that because I do feel like our voice in academia is important.
mhm.
And the more of us that there are, the more we're going to be able to demand to be taken seriously.
Yeah,
And like you mentioned, John Torres, like, he said something, talking about archaeologically speaking, that, archaeologists haven't found a lot of evidence showing how long we've been here, but it's hard to find something that you're not looking for. And if you
yeah,
think, a group of people has only been in the continent for 20,000 years, you're not going to look down 40,000 years, etc. And having our perspective saying, no, like our oral histories say that we've been here this long,
yeah,
and encouraging people to do that further research and do that deeper digging, literally.
yeah,
The more of us that there are, the more we're going to be listened to, the more we're going to be taken seriously. And so, although the experience can be difficult, especially, for women of color in general, having to work harder to be taken seriously, I also think that our voices are really, really important in the field.
all right. And I think that, and I 100% agree. So, and I hope any women, whether they be indigenous or otherwise, take this to heart and go into either history or archaeology or both. I'm a big fan that both fields need to be combined, personally, but that's just me. Uh, so the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to allow you to plug your little shops and other things that you may want to plug, and advertise.
Oh, yeah. So I'm on TikTok, diamond_dog74. I mean, if you search Diamond Dog, I'm the first person to pop up because I have the largest following as far as people with Diamond Dog in their username. And I also have, if you're on Instagram, Nerdy Native Beadwork, and that's where I sell my beadwork. And I am a generational beader. My mom taught me it, her mom taught her, so on and so forth. And so, keeping that tradition going in my family as well. And I also know how to make things out of leather. So that's something I got taught from my dad's side. So I also do like moccasins and stuff like that.
All right. Well, and with that, I thank you for coming on, Laura. This is the second time you've come on. It's been great both times. hope to have you on again. And everyone, have a great day.
Thank you.